Israel has expanded its Gaza ground offensive, vowing to hit the south with no less strength than the north. Joining me to discuss this is Wallis Simons. He's editor of the Jewish Chronicle and he's also author of Israelophobia, the newest version of the oldest hatred and what to do about it. Thank you very much, Jake, for joining us once again. Now, I think there's obviously I'd like to talk a little bit about events back here at home as well. But let's talk about what is actually going on in the Middle East, because we have seen the ground offensive, well, all the hostilities renewed since the ceasefire, the temporary truce was ended. No more hostages getting out, certainly for the time being. And we've seen this ground offensive from the Israeli Defense Forces moving further into the south. The south has always been bombed. There's going to be a difficulty here, though, isn't there? We've got a huge number of people, more than 1 million people in Gaza, displaced from the north, told, go south, you'll be safe in the south. They've also been bombed in the south. There is nowhere for them to go. People have been told even there's a sort of a grid system for them to move into. You can download an app and it will tell you where it's safe. But, often we're talking about, literally a field, a road. This will be safe for the next 24 hours. We are talking about families with children, elderly, some ill, people who haven't got access to food, water, electricity. This is untenable for the people of Gaza. How do you think that the IDF, and I've spoken many times about what they're doing, how do you think they can justify this now?
I think that there's certainly electricity in Gaza, as we've seen from the wide use of mobile phones.
I think a lot of them using, I've been told they're using solar power often to feed their...
Well, I mean, I think there is electricity in Gaza, whether it's solar or otherwise, I'm not clear. But there is a plan by the IDF to encourage civilians to move to the west, into that area there. And long term, I think there are hopes that there'll be some kind of displaced persons facility there in the southwest, perhaps with the border of Egypt, with Egypt being open so they can receive some medical care there, and perhaps with some international aid ships anchored off the shore there in the southwest, so that in the longer term, civilians will be able to stay put in one place that's protected from the fighting and receive all the care that they need. The Israelis, as far as I understand it, offered to set that facility up, but there was a sense that the Gazan people wouldn't trust them to do it, and so it falls to the international community to step in. I mean, I agree with you. I'm not trying to downplay the fact that there's great civilian suffering in Gaza at the moment. Let's be clear that that is a truth, and it's a tragic truth, and it's very, very sad indeed, especially for those of us who have one or two connections with people there. But unfortunately, war does bring civilian suffering. War is hell, and even a just and defensive war is hell. That's been true for centuries, for millennia. And sadly, it's no less true today, even when you have precision armaments. And a big part of that reason in this particular conflict is that Hamas are using their civilians as a weapon, as human shields, and as a propaganda weapon against Israel. So again, I don't want to downplay the suffering, but I think that we need to recognize that from Israel's point of view, it really is an impossible situation they find themselves in. On the one hand, they've been given the cause for a just war. They have no choice but to destroy this enemy, because otherwise they'll suffer repeated attacks. We saw just a few days ago the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, releasing a statement saying that Hamas intends to carry out the same massacre again and again and again.
Well, that's it. Look, I do agree with you, and we've discussed this before. This idea that Israel, and subject part of your book, Israelophobia, Israel is held to an impossibly high standard in terms of any actions it takes, way higher than we hold our own British military and any other military in the world in terms of the actions they must take. And whenever people say, well, Israel's got a right to self-defense, but they shouldn't be allowing the deaths of any civilians in Gaza, and there needs to be a ceasefire. Either they have a right of self-defense, or I'm afraid civilians are going to die. That's the awful truth. And as you say, it is Hamas that have kept many innocent civilians in the north, uses them as human shields, and has basically subjugated them and radicalized them. We know the education system in Gaza basically saying, the best thing you can do in life is kill Jews. I mean, that's literally what primary school age children are taught from dot onwards, and then we end up where we end up here. That said, I think there are many people who completely support Israel's right to exist, the right of the Jewish people to not face a massacre from a terrorist organisation like Hamas, and understanding the need for self-defence. But there comes a point when people say, look, but the death toll, as much as we can trust it, because all information is coming via Hamas, a terrorist organisation, we know we can't trust a lot of the things they say. The death toll, particularly of children, becomes untenable. And we know the Americans, massive supporters, obviously, of the Israelis and their military, have basically been saying, both publicly and privately, you need to stop killing so many civilians. How is that possible? And what's the impact that's going to be on the Israel Defense Forces?
Well, I think those people who understandably are concerned, as all of us are, about the impact of war on civilians, I think the question for them to answer, if you're seeking to campaign on that point, is what's the alternative? What are you asking Israel to do? Are you asking Israel to stop defending itself, to live with an enemy that is openly saying that it intends to carry out such massacres again? I mean, obviously, nobody would ask that. Britain wasn't asked to withhold its military firepower when we were trying to destroy Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which we did with a very high civilian death toll, and Iraq and elsewhere. And one can't help but recall those famous words that victory at all costs, victory despite the terror, and victory however long and hard the path may be, which was spoken, of course, by Winston Churchill in the Second World War, when we faced our own existential threat. So, Israel is acting as best as it can in impossible circumstances. What is the alternative? What was our alternative in the Second World War if we would have wanted to prevent the deaths of millions of Germans? What would we have done? Would we have held back and say, OK, well, we'll just let Hitler take over? Yeah. Israel's in a similar position, and it's very difficult to answer that question when you reverse it. What should Israel do instead?
Yeah, I mean that's the key thing, isn't it? So, what's the alternative? How do you think this is going to play out over the coming weeks and months? We know that this isn't something that's going to be over and done within a few days. We've still got well over 100 hostages still being held, including young children, elderly people, families being held by Hamas and indeed other groups who basically, basically a free-for-all. Let's just go and take Israeli hostages and then trade them in the aftermath. We don't know what conditions many of those people are in, who's dead, who isn't dead, who's being tortured, who's not. We know different stories have been coming out from those hostages already released. But we also know, the plight of the Palestinian people. This cannot continue, forever. How does this end? Because we know that Hamas, that is in the leadership in Gaza, they don't believe in a two-state solution. They want the destruction of Israel. Leaving them in charge isn't an option if Israel is to continue to exist and Israeli people are to be safe. But what is the solution? Because the Palestinian Authority, is led by people who we're told are moderates, but an awful lot of their beliefs and the people they've supported over the years suggest they really are not what you and I might think of as moderates.
That's right. I mean, I think that the first objective which Israel needs to achieve is the destruction of Hamas. And what that means is the destruction of Hamas as a viable military force and as an authority in Gaza. Obviously, you cannot eliminate an idea. We weren't able to eliminate the idea that Islamic State proposes, but we were able to destroy Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And a similar objective needs to be won in Gaza as well. So that begins with the destruction of the tunnels. So the Hamas no longer has this subterranean fortress to operate from. And then the destruction of their command and control structure and their commanders and their leadership and so on. After that, it then becomes an insurgency war, as we fought ourselves in Northern Ireland and elsewhere. But we're no longer contending with this sort of pseudo army, with this pseudo governing body, this terrorist governing body in Gaza. After that, I think then the real long, hard work begins. There's Israel's security concerns in Gaza, but then there's the big question which you brought up of who governs Gaza after that. Whether it's going to be a coalition of international actors, perhaps excluding the West, perhaps more the Arab world rather than international powers from Europe and the States, as Israel pulls out, pending the establishment of some kind of stability. But it's very difficult to know where to look for that stability, given that, as you've said, the Palestinian Authority is in many ways very, very extreme and certainly very corrupt and authoritarian. So all of these very big questions need to be addressed. But right now, it's a war. And the war needs to be won before any of those questions can be answered. Okay.